So just for this session is going to be on the city's website. So it was useful to have this actually recorded. So with those people who couldn't be in attendance tonight, still have an opportunity of seeing what was going on. So what a city can and can't do. This is part one of a 4-part series. Before we get going in earnest, I know that Councillor Vasilakos is here, and she was just going to provide a little bit of context to the sessions and to this one in particular tonight, potentially. Councillor.
Good evening, everyone. Just on behalf of Mayor Matheson and all of City Council, I just want to welcome everyone to these sessions and hope that they are actually useful and informative and engaging. And I think sort of some context for me would be, when I first ran for council, I ran for what I thought council did, and I had some of it right and I had some of it wrong. But what I really didn't understand is how much we couldn't do or couldn't control or wasn't within our purview, and the realization that the public also didn't have a really strong sense of that. And so I think this is a really great opportunity to have a review of that and understand what we do. And I just one little anecdote of my time on council. It says, "Who's driving the grader?" is Ian's book. And I think it's really interesting because sometimes I'll get a phone call from someone in the public and they think that I'm in the office every day running the public works department because I'm chair of infrastructure, transportation, and safety. And little do they know that I'm allowed in the public works yard building once a year at Christmas when they're having pizza, and there's caution tape up and the councillors are not allowed anywhere near the graders. And so, sort of this sort of conversation around who's driving the grader is, I think, a really good one, because not only is who's driving it, who's paying for it, who decide what kind of grader we want, and what kind of work is the grader going to do for you, are all the kinds of things that I hope that this session brings. And so thank you to Ian, and thank you to everyone who came tonight. And I hope you have a really great session and the next sessions as well.
Thanks, Councillor. We'll get to the grader bit kind of a little bit in earnest. My style is is interactive, so we certainly will talk a little bit about this. This, of course, as the Councillor mentioned, is part one of a 4-part series, and kudos to the City of Stratford for doing this. I haven't run across an occurrence before of a city that is willing to do this kind of information or education globally for the public. Sometimes this runs concurrently to things like elections, but sometimes it's just almost there's an assumption, if you like, that people know what cities do or what cities can't do. And while I say cities, I think we're going to use we may use the term cities, but it's more general in terms of different types of local governments. So when Mayor Matheson and I started having a conversation about this, probably 3, 4, or 5 months ago, and Rowena McKinnott was part of that conversation as well through Wise Communities, the idea came about for somebody who was independent from the city, who has done some work a lot of work in this sphere in Canada, to just provide a little bit of an overview, respond to some questions if there are some, and see where that gets us in terms of public education associated with local government in the Canadian context and Ontario specifically. So we broke it down into 4 sessions. The first one today is essentially just the role of local government in the lives of the people who live in the community. The next one in a couple of weeks is role clarity. So we'll speak specifically at that time to the role of council, the role of individual members of council, the role of the mayor, administration, and then management and service delivery as well. Kind of who's responsible for what. So why it is that Councillor Vasilakos isn't allowed to drive the grader even if she really wants to. The third session will be on local engagement, communication and engagement. We will touch on that a little bit today as well, but how the municipality interacts with the people who live there is very important. So we'll spend a couple hours or one of our sessions talking about that. And then finally, the last session, about a month and a half or 2 months from now, a month and a half, I guess, we'll be dealing with public finance, specifically the sources of revenue that are available to a municipality. The Coles Notes version is there aren't very many if you compare it to other orders of government or even the United States, local government in the United States. The other end is how does money get spent in terms of budgeting? We'll speak to that a little bit later on today, again, just to give you a bit of an overview. So there's a note here about questions and comments. Because this is on Zoom, first of all, I'm not sure if it's suboptimal. It's the best plan B we've got other than gathering around a table and having a great conversation. So please do put your hand up. I'm on a relatively small screen here, so I may not see a whole lot. If you just want to interrupt at some, well, interrupting is not a great idea. But if you would like to interject at some point and just make a comment or ask a question, please by all means do that. Put your comments and questions in the chat. It pops up here on my screen, and maybe as we break from section to section, I'll stop at that. I will also suggest that the slides here are available on the city's website. So now or later, if you haven't already got them, you're welcome to have a copy of them. Some people often ask for that. So they'll be available there, or they are available there. So with that in mind, so because we are in the online environment, we recognize it's not ideal. So I often use the term of asking each other for a little bit of extra grace and patience as we work through all of this together. The nice thing about local government, perhaps other orders of government and the way it interacts with their citizens, is that we don't all think alike. So there are different ideas and different opinions, and that space in many ways is where value lies. If we're looking to change things from the way they are to some ideal future state, it's only by challenging the status quo, looking for innovation and accepting risk that actually happens. And the same thing goes for tonight too. So if there are controversial ideas or contested ideas, please bring them out. However, if I do put a caveat to that, if there are inappropriate comments that come out, I'll ask that person to refrain. And if they don't refrain, I have the ability to remove people from the session. So just note that up front. And finally, you all know, I think, that the session is being recorded and it'll be available on the city's website if you want to have a look at it a little bit later. So this is your time. I am here to provide a little bit of context, some overview, some information, and perhaps answer some of your questions as well. I will say, though, that while I know a little bit about Stratford and its recent history, and its long history as well, for that matter, I'm not an expert on that. I'm an expert, if you like, on local government in Canada. I'd like this to be more of a seminar than a lecture, so I'd like to know your thoughts as well. I learn from these in the same way that other people do as well. We use a term quite often called good governance or great governance. And my take on that is, if you're looking for the ideal future state for a local government in Canada, or how a council works, or how a council interacts with the people who live in a place, there are lots of ways to do that. There's some ways to do it really badly, but there are also quite a lot of ways to do it really well. And so it's those routes up the mountain that we're looking at. We know, as a bit of a Pollyanna, I think that people bring their best to local government and probably to other orders of government too. You all have chosen to live in Stratford. You've chosen to move there, remain there. There's got to be a reason for that. You likely believe that that's the best place to live. And you're right. And you want each other to be successful. In order for council to be successful, the citizens, the organizations, the businesses who live in Stratford need to be successful too. And the opposite is also true. For them to be successful, the council needs to be successful as well. And the final comment kind of reiterates something I made a little while ago about let's have some interesting conversation this evening. So if you want to disagree with opinions and interpretations, please do. A bit about me. As I mentioned, my name's Ian McCormack. My contact information is at the bottom of every page, and I've done that specifically and generally so that if you have questions that come after the session, you have every opportunity to write down my email address, look up my website and phone number, and if you want to give me a call tomorrow or next week, have a question about something, please do. This is my area of passion, and I love talking about it and speaking to people who are engaged around the country about it. So please reach out after the fact if you like as well. My company, Strategic Steps, has offices in Alberta and Saskatchewan. We say we operate in that space between elected and appointed. And so that's how we talk about governance. So it's the interaction between the two as they make their communities the best that they can be. In terms of the specific things that we often do, it oftentimes depends on election cycles. So if we were to look at just a 4-year election cycle, we often do things like candidate workshops to, as Councillor Vasilako said, help people understand what the role of councillor is before they hand in all their nomination forms and sign up for the job potentially for the next 4 years. We do a lot of orientations following the election. So we did a bunch in Saskatchewan last year because that was their election time. We'll do a bunch in Alberta this year because it's their election time. So it's just cyclical. We do a lot of strategic planning for municipalities. We're off to Prince George, BC next week to work with them, and Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, I think the week after that. So a lot of governance work there. If we do reviews of organizations or municipalities that aren't working terribly well sometimes. So a governance review or an organizational review, trying to get the animal pointed in the right direction. And if there are code of conduct reviews to be done, across the country, there are different ways of dealing with council code of conduct complaints. Some, like you, have specific people named to do that. In other parts of the country, they don't even require code of conduct legislation or bylaws. So it kind of runs the full gamut. I do quite a lot of speaking and writing for the Saskatchewan Urban Municipalities Association. I write a column in all of their magazines called Governance Voice. I've done some writing for Municipal World, which is Canada's national magazine. The councillor referenced my book, Who's Driving the Grader, which was published last fall. And it speaks to the difference between governance and management, or governance and administration. That's actually the link that I got involved with Stratford from, with Lorena and with the mayor having read it and then reaching out to me. I also have another book coming out shortly on the aptitudes of the best mayors. I've interviewed about a dozen mayors from across the country, and actually one in Australia as well, looking at the principles of what makes a good mayor. We're calling it the DNA of great leaders at the moment. So we're looking at mayors, and probably it will apply to other leaders as well, in terms of what I've seen is kind of the three ways that leadership works. You need to come into the position with personal aptitudes that make it appropriate to you. Some people are good at this type of a role, and for some people, it's the last thing they would ever want to do. So they have those personal aptitudes coming in. They're often community leaders from way back when. They were on the library board or a recreation board, or part of a church group or a cancer charity, and have led the community for a long time. So that's where they come in. And finally, there are some technical pieces to this too, to being a great leader. And those are the skills that you can learn. So you have those personal aptitudes, you grow the community leadership, and you can develop governance skills. So that's what's coming up. So we have nearly 40 people in here at the moment, and I wondered about posing a few questions right off the bat. Just looking at this, if there would be 2 or 3 people on each one of these who might be offer what you think the best thing that the city does or provides for you and your family, what would you change potentially about how Stratford works? And I've given you my 2 cents worth about what I think great or good governance is, and kind of what does that mean to you? And just a more general question, over the course of the 4 sessions, if you attend them all, do you have some hopes that come out of that? So if I can just start at the top, and I can't see very many of you on my screen, but is there anybody who would like to offer what it is that makes Stratford so great? Somebody must think it's pretty good. Well, this could be a short session. Please do, Lorena.
I mean, for me, I love the scale of the city and the diversity of it. I love the diversity of the people and the businesses, the enterprises that are here. The physicality of the city is very, very beautiful. And that goes back to the scale, that you can really walk a lot of the city, and it's very accessible that way. So for me, I grew up in a small community in Manitoba, and this city actually reminds me a lot of that it's an intimate, but it's a diverse city.
Thanks. There's somebody in the chat has said that best service bar none is the Stratford Public Library, the only service without extra user fees. So I am a former library board chair and library trustee for 12 years myself. So I would, in a public library, so I would certainly echo Ken's comments there. Anybody else want to jump in here? Tori, you're unmuted. I'm not sure if that's on purpose or not. Okay.
I'm Jane Marie, and I think that there's lots of diversity and different interests, and we have an awful lot of groups. No matter what your interest is, there's going to be other people that have the same. Mm-hmm. And so we have lots of groups, and they do lots of things in the city.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is David Neese. I think most people would agree that the quality of life here is very, very high because we have a small, compact city surrounded by a very intensive and successful agricultural community. And the city is very diverse in terms of its economic makeup. And it offers tremendous appeal to people who come from other larger communities where the urban density is much higher and where they feel that their needs may be met, but they're met here in Stratford in a way that is a lot more accommodating. And it's a very attractive place for people to settle, particularly in their retirement period.
Thank you. Well, I'm an apprentice retiree myself. I'm working hard towards getting there. Is there anything anybody else wants to add, or I'll just move on to the next question? Jamie.
Yes, Ian, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, yes. I think Stratford is a relatively very safe community for people to live. It does have that industry, arts, and culture, and the good mix of agriculture, and with that, and I think that gives it a very healthy, diverse economy, but also a very diverse culture. And it does maintain somewhat of a small town feel. I like to bike. It's very easy to access most corners of the city through means other than a car, right? So it's pedestrian, it's relatively pedestrian, bike friendly, and it has a sense of scale that feels very human, as opposed to some of the larger cities. When I go there, just the scale of it seems to lose a little bit of.
Okay, thanks very much. So let's move on. Are there things that you would change? Just a couple minutes on this. I've got a note here just from Ken again saying he would like fewer but full-time city councillors, representation by the 5 hamlets rather than at large, so ward or division based, and then ranked ballots. It says quality of life is high for maybe half the city, and some other pieces there about housing and wages. Tori says combination we have in Stratford, ranging from our festival to our numerous sporting opportunities, gives us many amenities of a large city while living in the comforts of a small city, makes it a place that offers the best of all worlds. Ken notes there's a high percentage of seniors, many transferred their wealth here so they can do well. Marg says it's family friendly. You guys should just write the vision statement for the city or the motto for the city. What would you change, if anything, about the city? Anybody? We can come back to that if you like. So the last, I'm going to skip over to good governance just so we can keep going on this. But what do you want to get from this series? So when the city decided to organize, when council decided to organize this series, they were interested in providing information to the public. But I suspect that there are people here in the public who would like to get something specific out of it. So Ken, I think it said earlier too, it's nice to have this sort of thing happen, not during an election. Where was that? It's a nice lead into budget discussions 2022. Always been disappointed in how few citizens got involved in pre-budget and how so many more complain after the fact. So with that in mind, oops, where are we now? Yeah. What do you want to get from the series? What can I help provide you other than what I've already kind of told you about in outline? Anything specific? Well, if nobody has anything, that's an expectation I can meet. I'm going to move on and we'll see where we end up. If you have other things you want to say, please do. So the first piece we're going to talk about is kind of council's oversight role. Some of you have already referenced council, and we're going to speak to them, of course, because they are the kind of the titular head of the organization, if you like. Just a couple of notes here about what people want to see. I noticed a couple of things show up in chat. Mandatory voting. It is very rare for the mayor city council who has to have the support of constituents, often 10 to 20% support. So how legitimate are the decisions that they make? Not sure if that's rhetorical or not. Somebody said, I would like the city to take a proactive approach to interacting with citizens. So that's Tory Dyke. We're starting that right now. Bill said, I would change the relationship between City Hall and the community, the engagement, moving from the occasional problem or issue prompted consultation to a steady, regular engagement as an ongoing conversation. Somebody else said about the meetings, how to most efficiently and effectively effect change. That's very alliterative. Ken suggested, I forgot to mention term limits for elected positions, too many there for the past and can't see the future. I'm going to leave it at that and move on. And if there are more, we'll look at that at the next type of break in our session here. I will say too, that term limits come up a lot and right across the country. So it's not just you. It's one of those things, however, we will deal with when we talk about which order of government actually has authority to do what. And in actual fact, local government has no authority to set term limits. So a councillor could conceivably come into office on a platform that I'm going to stay here for two terms or whatever, and we're going to change a bylaw and mandate term limits, but they can't do it. It would contradict the Canadian Constitution, and somebody would likely challenge it. We'll get to that a little bit later. So if we think about kind of why council is here, if there was nobody who lived in the geographical area that is now Stratford, there would be no need for an oversight body, which is council. And there would be no need for a city manager and a rec department and cultural groups because nobody would be here. But they are, and you've all said why you like Stratford. And I suspect there are other reasons that other people would provide as well. So if we think about that, council is not looking after the day-to-day of the city because they've hired people to do that, to pick up the garbage and put on community service programs and those sorts of things. So council is there to steer the ship in the long term. They're looking kind of maybe a generation into the future about what does Stratford look like. Sometimes I say, what does Stratford look like when it's grown up or when it's completely successful or when you can imagine far enough down the road that you're probably still living here, but members of council have probably completely changed. So that's the ideal future state, and that's what they're working towards. So when they look that far out, they can look at this 4-year term that they're there, or the 8 years or 12 years that they happen to serve, or whatever it might be, and say, what am I going to do over this term to help us get from here to there? So from that, they set a vision for the community and a mission for the community and a set of values for the community and that sort of thing. And they will work on designing that plan that gets us from here to a generation from now with biting off the next 4 years. And then we'll have a look at who benefits from that. Are we looking at collective benefit for everybody who lives in Stratford? Are we looking for the benefit of people in a small geographical area of Stratford because there's a necessity there? For example, maybe all the water mains are made of wood in part of town, and I have run across that. And so just part of town needs a lot of money spent in it. So that takes away from things that could be elsewhere because there's still only 100% of dollars to be spent. Municipal governments don't borrow and don't borrow as much as other orders of government and have significant restrictions on their budgeting in terms of balanced budgets as well. So different affordability. We look at who's going to benefit. So I just mentioned that the precedence of the individual or the collective. I think we're seeing that too with Canada's federal election at the moment about the parties who are running. Some of the parties further to the right of the Conservatives, for example, are pushing individual freedom or responsibility, that kind of thing. But people live together in community and there's a cost to that. So people, if they wanted to have absolute freedom, I suppose they could go live in the bush someplace. But we don't, we live in community. So we're looking at collective benefit. And finally here, in order for this to work and not to go madly off in all directions, I promote what I call cascading alignment. So if you have an idea of what the city is successful, the ultimate vision of success for the city is in a generation, and we're working on it from now till then, we can actually start thinking about what adds value, where are our priorities? And so we can fund some things that are important to us, recognizing that not everything is going to get funded. Not only that, everything that gets added to a city is a political decision. Everything that gets changed is a political decision, and everything that gets removed is a political decision. An example of that we see, and I would be surprised if you do too, is the recent prominence of pickleball. It's a small thing, but a lot of people used to play tennis. They don't play as much anymore. And now there are more people who play pickleball. So some municipalities have been converting tennis courts into pickleball courts, as well as building some new ones. But originally the decision about tennis was to build those courts, and that was a political decision that met a need of citizens. But now it's not so much necessary anymore. So rather than building a bunch of new courts, we're converting existing tennis into pickleball. And that's a political decision too, because there's still a group of people who like tennis. Anyway, the point being that there are scarce resources and you're trying to apply them the best way that you can. I think about priorities as well. So if you have 100% of resources to spend as a municipality, and resources in this case can be people, it can be time, it can be money, it can be political capital, culture, all those sorts of things. And you're putting them to the highest and best use. And in this case, I look at priority as a matrix of timeliness and importance. So something that's neither timely nor important is really not a high priority. Something that is both timely and important is a high priority. And these things will change over time. They'll change over the course of a 4-year term. For example, I suspect Councillor Vasilakos and her colleagues never got elected expecting to have to deal with COVID. But all of a sudden they had to, and then you end up moving into crisis management mode. Other things have happened too, both other orders of government downloading, for example, or federal government decisions that have an impact on local governments across the country that they have to deal with. And so they have to start understanding, or not start, they have to understand as council, the city, that it can't be all things to all people. What it is that makes Stratford unique, I guess just by default, would mean that me here in Melville, Saskatchewan isn't Stratford because they choose a slightly different route up that hill of great governance, as with every other community in this country. And because you've got limited funding, you put it to what's important. A lot of municipalities are using something called priority-based budgeting, or PBB now. And it talks about, let's identify all the services and programs the city offers, and let's ordinally rank them on an annual basis or a quadrennial basis. And we'll put money to the highest order things, and those things which nobody uses anymore kind of fall off the bottom. Example of this, working in a small town in rural Alberta, they still have horse hitching posts on Main Street, and they were still getting funded, but nobody remembers the last time anybody actually hitched a horse to Main Street. So that examined life well lived is something that they're after. When I think about why people run for office, this is explained in more detail in my book, and it talks about a continuum of service. I believe that people are elected to office or run for office. I guess whether they get elected is up to the citizens, the voters. They run either because they're interested in public service or they're interested in self-service. They either want to tell people what to do, or they want to go out and listen to what people want and help them achieve that. And I think that's part of those personal attributes that I mentioned a little while ago as well. So I don't think there's anybody at complete ends of the spectrum. There's no complete altruist who is there just for the public good. And I don't think there are terribly many Machiavellians at the other end who are just in there for their own benefit in the long term. And when I think about the attributes that they bring to office as city council, there's half a dozen of these attributes, from motivation all the way down to results. And through this continuum, then these attributes have an impact. I'm just going to mute Hartley here, I think. See if that works. Oh, I can't see that again. Okay, so anyway, there are these attributes here, and if you want to have a look at the slides and have a longer, greater discussion about them, we absolutely can. But if you look at people who are running for office, or even people who are serving in office now, whether it's in Stratford or whether it's your local, your provincial or national representatives or somewhere else as well, where do you think the people you're dealing with actually fit on the scale? And they're going to be somewhere between here, and it's quite healthy for a council to have a mix of people. You don't want the pure public service, and you certainly don't want the pure self-service, but you want a team that is kind of the highest, has the highest level of attributes that you can get in these areas. So that's the piece that I was just going to talk to you very briefly about council's oversight role before we get into what the city actually can't do. A bunch of people have put some stuff in the chat here. I'm just going to have a quick look through it and see if there's anything that we should have a look at. Term limits, so in some of the section, Margaret said, bringing many different kinds of people to the table for healthy and respectful dialogue. I think we just had a bit of a conversation about that. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about engagement. I would love to see an easy to use approach, says Tori, to letting citizens know what's going on in our city and how they can get involved, more engagement. Ken says council is here, frankly, to simply approve what staff tells them to do. They defer to staff, in my opinion, way too much. In my experience, about 3-4 on council listen to citizens and either bring up concerns at meetings or get answers to questions. That leaves about 7 who basically vote and shoot from the hip. Ken, we'll get into that a little bit later too, because sometimes one of the principles I find is where you stand depends on where you sit. And things change between when you're elected and, between when you're running for office and when you're elected. So I certainly don't dispute your comment in some cases, but I think there's some rationale to it too. I think Al says, in Ontario, the Municipal Election Act does allow a municipal clerk to make a change if that change, i.e. term limits, is desirable or necessary. I'll have to look into that. Someone said, Ken said, representatives voted in should be there to represent the cumulative majority values of their constituents. The long-term view improved quality of life. So with this, Ken, a little bit later, I'd like your comment on this. So what about the concept of short-term pain for long-term gain? If you have a city council who realizes that in order for something good to happen 5 years from now, something bad, I mean, that's kind of parochial, has to happen now. If we're always voting in the cumulative majority values, you end up with a populist government. And populists seem to be really good at short term and not very good at long term. And I can certainly respond to that a little bit later. Someone suggested that city could hold referendums and change the election process, which requires agreement at the provincial level. Fair enough. Smart, clear referendums. Reasons why people run an election: to be viewed as popular, to hold higher status, the part-time easy money, to try and affect change, to advocate for a particular lobby group, and to challenge themselves. You might be right on some of those for sure. So what you have described in many ways, I think of those people who are the self-service people rather than the community service or public service people. And certainly would be interested in hearing from you a little bit more of that. So those are some comments that I've just seen in the chat. We've just done this council oversight piece and are about to move on into city role. Does anybody who's verbally on here want to have a comment or ask a question about the stuff that they've seen so far? As a consultant, I'm taught to give 5 seconds before I move on. So please, if anybody does have something they want to add in, I'm more than happy to respond as well. So what the city can and can't do is the piece we're going to deal with right now. You likely know this, but we're going to start with a bit of the Coles Notes version. About the 4 orders of government in Canada. Federal government, of course, we're on the middle of an election. They're looking after things which are pan-Canadian, so coast to coast to coast areas of interest, or in some cases, they focus in a particular area if they see a particular area needs help, whether it's crisis management, disaster services, that sort of thing, whether it needs specific economic uplift or assistance, or whether things have to change in a particular area. So examples of things the feds do, of course, I've mentioned some of these pan-Canadian things like immigration, like the postal service, national defense, and I put health into here, even though I think all 4 orders of government have a piece in health. But national health policy, the Canada Health Act, for example, is under the authority of the feds. If we look at the provinces and territories, which are established via the Constitution, and then potentially changes the Constitution a little bit, these are obviously the geographically constrained areas, so just part of the country. Now, most of our, I think anyway, most of our states, most of our provinces is the same size as a lot of the smaller states in the world. So they're geographically anyway, even if we don't have the population. And areas that they typically look at, there's a full list if you look at the list of ministries on the Government of Ontario website or any province or territory. Things like labor policy, they look at energy, as do provinces in some ways. The one that we're most interested in tonight is municipal affairs, and education is primarily a responsibility of the province or territory. And finally, we're going to look a lot more into the areas of local interest. So local governments, rural and urban local governments. We're going to concentrate primarily on urban local governments and on Stratford in particular. And then the 4th order being Indigenous government with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, all of which have an impact right across the country. Some of which are under treaty. A lot of geographic area which is not. So we're seeing things like self-government and truth and reconciliation, obviously now with things like residential schools over the last little while too. The note to this is that all of these orders of government have to work together if we're going to have a successful society. So if we look at about national here, the national government had created the Constitution in 1867 with the Constitution Act, was modified again in the 1980s when it was actually repatriated back to Canada. And under the Constitution, there's no mention of municipalities as a specific order of government. All the Constitution says is that anything to do with local government belongs to the provinces and territories. So this section 92, which is in here, just talks about a whole list of things that the provinces can do or are responsible for. Number 8 on that list is municipal institutions in the provinces and the territories. So it's not even really recognized as an order of government. In practicality, what that means is every province and territory deals with local government in a slightly different way. You have, for example, the Municipal Act, Municipalities Act. In other parts of the country, those things are called different things. In Saskatchewan, for example, they have the Cities Act. In the Northwest Territories, they have the Hamlets Act. In Alberta, they have the Municipal Government Act. They're all different across the country. So the understanding of local government in one part of the country is not the same elsewhere. As an example of that, counties have different terminology in Ontario than they would in Alberta. BC has something called a regional municipality. Saskatchewan has something called a rural municipality. So there are different bits and pieces that make up local government around the country. Even though some of the principles end up fairly similar, the actual way it's carried out is different. So comparing a town or a city in Ontario to a town or city somewhere else in the country is, while it's not like comparing apples and oranges, it's kind of like comparing golden delicious apples to red delicious apples. As an example of cities, I have different numbers of people which are required. In Alberta, to be a city, you need 10,000 people minimum. I'm in Saskatchewan at the moment in the city of Melville, which has 4,500 people. So their rules are different too. And within that, of course, there are other specific attributes that are provided to local government in some states, some provinces and territories that aren't the same right across the country. So my point here is, if you were dealing with something like a Federation of Canadian Municipalities, it's not the same from coast to coast to coast, but they're all governed by the Constitution, which essentially just says, here provinces and territories, you set up the rules for municipalities. So here, if we look at the relevant legislation, you've got the Constitution, which is the same right across the coast and coast to coast to coast. We've got the Municipal Act in Ontario, and all municipal acts will do the first thing here. It'll establish municipalities. And within the idea of establishing municipalities, it creates municipalities, it could dissolve municipalities, it deals with intermunicipal collaboration, if you like, in terms of maybe it's not collaboration, but annexation or amalgamation potentially would be in those acts as well. So municipal structures. There was a case in Manitoba a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, where the provincial government in Manitoba thought there were too many municipal governments, really small, unsustainable ones. And they said, hey, every municipality, go find a dance partner or two until you can get your population up to 1,000 people. And that's going to be your new municipal size. And if you don't find your dance partner, we'll do it for you. So they have almost arbitrarily or artificially made their municipalities more sustainable by making them bigger, and therefore by making fewer of them. I mean, as mentioned, I'm in Saskatchewan at the moment. They have, I think, 350 municipalities in Saskatchewan with a population of just over 1 million people. So you can see that some of them are really, really tiny, different places to places. Your Municipal Act also talks about what higher and lower order municipalities can do. Higher, just in terms of the rules they operate by, the services they offer, those sorts of things. And it talks about councils. Every municipal act across the country speaks of councils, but it tends to provide just the skeleton of that, about a default number, if you like, a number of people on a council, whether council can change that number by themselves or not. Requiring meeting rules and decision-making authority, things like the ability to create bylaws and policies, and other pieces too. Some provincial governments say you must have a chief administrative officer or CAO. Others are silent on that. So they're different from place to place. In a lot of places, if you take all the municipal acts, so if you went to places like the Northwest Territories, which actually has, I think, 3 municipal acts, 2 or 3, I think they've got Yellowknife Act, cities, town, villages, and hamlets. If you went to those places, you would find that these acts are typically one of the 2 or 3 largest acts in the province or territory. And that's because much of what's in those acts is technical in nature. It's about municipal assessment or asset management or land use planning, those sorts of things which show up in the acts, but could conceivably, I guess, be their own acts as well. And there's a whole lot more to it as well. You can certainly, these acts, all these pieces of legislation are on provincial websites. The Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, you have the longest name of a Information and Privacy Act, I think, in the country. Speaks specifically to about release of information. So there's two pieces of that. By default, information is free. Any citizen has access to any piece of information that any order of government has. However, it's the caveat to it, or restriction on it, is protection of privacy. So there are lots of reasons or exemptions to disclosure that are legitimate reasons for that. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. When they look at those exemptions, some of them are mandatory and some of them are discretionary. Now, if there's something, solicitor-client privilege, for example, there is a real and legitimate reason to keep some things behind closed doors without prejudicing the outcome of something. This is one of those cases where what happens on the outside of local government and what happens on the inside of local government is a difference between what's perception and what's reality, with various shades of gray in there too. But some municipalities too will then, if they look at discretionary exemptions to disclosure, will choose by and large to disclose. Some municipalities will choose by and large not to disclose. And the relevant section of legislation has to be noted about why that something is particularly gone in camera or is an exception to disclosure or not. So these are the pieces of legislation that we typically look at. If we were to look specifically at you in Ontario, this is the purpose of the municipality. And this is pretty common, that very early in municipal acts, usually kind of right after the section on definitions, it speaks to why we actually have, what's the purpose of having local government wherever it happens to be. So in this case, now the highlighting is added by me, just to draw some attention to this. It talks about local government being responsible and accountable. So it is government elected by the people, it's government for the people, and it's accountable to the people. And that happens at least once every 4 years. If there's usually 4 years, in some places it's still 3. 4 years in terms of an election, or more frequently than that if it's a by-election. Some of you have spoken about referenda and plebiscites, and those typically aren't binding, but they do certainly talk about responsible and accountable government. And the other note I've noted, or the other piece I've noted here about respect for matters within their jurisdiction. So within the boundaries of the city of Stratford has control within certain exemptions that are under other jurisdictions, like provincial jurisdiction or federal jurisdiction. But the city can do within reason what the city wants to do within that space. When it comes to intermunicipal, so what happens on the boundaries between Stratford and any of its neighbors, then there's a point of negotiation that has to happen. And some provinces have actually pushed for that, to say there has to be some sort of formal intermunicipal agreement between you and your neighbor and your neighbor and your neighbor. And some have said it's just on various topics. So for example, just on recreation, does your neighboring municipality charge different fees for people from Stratford than they do for their own? And is it reciprocal? Or things like mutual aid agreements for emergency services. Will you help us put a fire out if we promise to help you put a fire out, even if it's across a municipal jurisdictional line? So those are some of the purposes that are there. If you look at how council operates, they really only have 3 tools that they can use. I call them the levers of governance, if you like. You've probably already heard about these, you've probably seen them, and some of you probably even read a few. Council's strongest tool is bylaws. In this case, you probably know that a bylaw requires at least three separate votes of council to create or to modify or to remove. Any of these tools, when it gets to bylaw and policy, any changes made to a bylaw or policy have to be made using the same tool. So you can't use a policy to modify a bylaw, and you can't use a bylaw to modify a policy, for example. But anyway, council, if it's something that's really important, council will use a bylaw for that. And things like fees and charges or land use and those kind of things will typically be bylaws. Things like council codes of conduct are often in bylaws too, though not universally. And it gives legislative authority, which means it provides the city the authority to act something, to make other people do something, and to penalize people if they don't do it. So this is where the ability of a municipality to levy fines, for example, would come from. So things like fees and charges, what it costs to go skating or to park downtown potentially would be set within a bylaw. And those are all public. They should be, most of the time, larger municipality will post all their bylaws on their website. Sometimes the smaller ones don't, just because of technical capabilities or capacity. But they're there, they're public documents and you can see them. So I mentioned it takes 3 readings or 3 votes to do that. It actually can take 4 if they want to do it all at once. The idea behind the 3 votes is to say, let's consider it today. We'll take a couple of votes on this and see if we still want to do this. And then we'll come back in a couple of weeks and we'll do the 3rd vote on it to see if we really want to approve it. It's kind of that time for sober second thought. However, if it's something that's just a slam dunk and they just want to do it and it just makes sense to everybody, they can in fact do all 3 readings or votes in the same meeting, as long as there is typically unanimous consent to do that. Now, I don't know that that's universal across the country, but it's pretty typical. So there are lots of bylaws, but there are even more policies. And policy is divided into governance policy and administrative policy. Right now, we're just talking governance, so the stuff that council controls. The city body itself has its own policies too, but we're just going to ignore those for right now. The reason you have policy, or a city has policy, there's a couple of reasons. One is so that it's predictable, so that people know how the city is going to act. They know, for example, how long the grass is supposed to be before you cut it. So those kind of things can be said in policy. It also avoids repeated questions. So administration is not supposed to think for itself and go freelance. It's supposed to take direction from council. So if council doesn't say how long or how often the snow should be plowed, for example, or what depth of snowpack before we get out there and plow, conceivably the the public works person could come to council when it snows and say, do you want me to plow the snow now? They could come tomorrow and ask the same question, and tomorrow and ask the same question. But what policy does is says, whenever we get 10 centimeters of packed snow, go plow it. Don't come ask us again. And that will provide that predictability. It avoids the repeated questions. Everybody knows that that's what's going to happen in that case. Policy only requires a single vote in order to enact, to change, or to repeal. So, and as policies and bylaws both remain on the books until they're repealed. So it's conceivable in a municipality that you could have bylaws or policies which are 40 or 50 or 60 years old because nobody's looked at them and they're all in hard copy in a binder someplace in a vault, but they're still in force. People may not know they're there, but they can still be used. So I'm a proponent of making sure that councils have a go through on all their bylaws and policies kind of once a term, if at all possible. So those are the 2 kind of legislative, if you like, levers they've got. The 3rd is around budget. I already mentioned things like priority-based budgeting. You put your money where your mouth is, or you put your money on things that are most important. So even if the city doesn't explicitly say what its priorities are, it is putting money someplace into a bunch of different, probably millions of dollars of expenses in various areas. And it tells you or signals to you what the city or what city council thinks is important. Now, a bunch of the budget is just going to pay salaries or pay the insurance bill, keep the street lights on, those sorts of things. But is money going to programs and services that are still needed? Are people who live in Stratford comfortable with the way the budget is being spent? Are you within some sort of a spending limit? Most provinces, if not all provinces, will set a borrowing limit for municipalities, and they need to stay within that. My final comment on this is around legislative paramountcy. And this is a concept which is quite useful because it talks about what you can and can't do, if you like. If, for example, the city was to pass a bylaw about national defense, to say, hey, we think that I don't know, I just made this up off the top of my head. But if council was to create a bylaw about national defense, it really would have no authority to do that because it's not within their jurisdiction. And so any federal law that had to do with defense would supersede anything that the city wanted to do anyway. And in that case, that part becomes, that the bylaw or the policy becomes null and void. If, however, that bylaw also made reference to something that was within the city's control, like speed limits on urban roads, I don't know why you do those together, but whatever, then the piece about speed limits on urban roads would still remain in effect. It's only that piece which is in contravention that can't keep going. And so there's a requirement at that point then for city council to have a look at whatever that piece is, the bylaw or the policy, and change it so that it's no longer in conflict with the higher order legislative piece. So I'm just going to take a bit of a break here, and I see we've got some comments or questions in the chat box. And then if anybody else wants to say anything, I'm more than happy to listen to them. Where are we? Ken says federal government gives dollars to province to get A, re-elected, and B, to do stuff. So that's one of my favorite terms, is to do stuff, because that's what government does. Provincial government banks or rechannels the money from feds to A, get re-elected, to hoard money, or to do stuff, and D, downloads work to cities without money. So I do agree with you that there's a lot of downloading that happens, and it only goes one way. You can't push that string up a hill. And the download often downloads responsibility without authority. And often that includes the lack of resources as well. So local government tries to make do with what they get from the province and applies to grants from anyone who gives them. Al says municipalities need to be recognized in the federal or provincial constitutions. Cities and towns need to be at the table when decisions are made by the feds and the provinces. You'll get no argument from me, but I suspect that there aren't any provincial constitutions, but there would have to be a change to the federal constitution to recognize municipalities as an order of government. There is something in the Federation of Canadian Municipalities called the Big Cities Caucus, which is just the 20 or 25 largest cities in the country that often do get a seat at that table, but they get it by the heft that they bring rather than by any sort of constitutional validity. Question here, why is freedom of information not free? Typically, the requirement is if somebody makes a valid freedom of information request, there is a cost to bringing that information together. I can't comment specifically in Stratford, but that's often why there are fees associated with freedom of information. However, some of those fees can be onerous, and you can look at whether those fees are legitimate or not as part of the fees and charges bylaw that the city would have to adopt. And that is something that a candidate for office certainly could speak to if they wanted to. There are frivolous and vexatious freedom of information requests too, and that might be part of a reason why there's a cost associated. Ken says freedom of information cost is not the issue. The issue of Stratford is an automatic no response, followed by the maximum longest wait period, followed by city lawyers funding ways to say no. I'm going to leave that the way it is. You would know your situation more than I do. Oh, the first reference to Chigny shows up. A lack of transparency or accountability. We're going to get to that later too in our, well, we'll have a whole session on that. We'll talk about transparency and accountability today and some of the engagement piece about how cities and citizens connect in session number 3. Why are bylaws not given much in the way of teeth or compliance? So there's an interesting piece to that. We're going to look at Council Code of Conduct, and Council does have the ability to put teeth into bylaws if there is the will to do it and if they have the authority to do it. Oftentimes bylaws will identify what you want to have, what city wants to have happen, what constitutes a breach of whatever that bylaw happens to be, but oftentimes that's where it stops. And sometimes things like sanctions, whether they are teeth or compliance, are not as detailed as they can be. Can't comment specifically on the one you may be talking about here. Stratford operating budget's about $70 million a year, says Ken, roughly the same amount as festival spends in a normal year. Stratford can go into debt about $100 million. Cities are expected to balance budgets. That's true. So oftentimes the borrowing limit for municipalities is often about 1.5 times the operating budget. Now, if anybody knows differently for Ontario, let me know, but that's typically what I've seen. So conceivably, you could do that. A lot of cities in particular will actually set a policy that they won't go that high. So if they could borrow 1.5 times, they say, we're going to cap our internal borrowing limit at 1 time or 0.8 times or 1.2 times. But that is okay because it doesn't contradict the provincial legislation. If you were to say the city is going to go to 2 times our annual operating budget, that would contradict a cap that may be in your provincial legislation, and therefore that piece about legislative paramountcy would come into effect, and it would be null. That part of the bylaw would be null and void. Again, you would know your situation more than mine, but cities are expected to balance budgets, and I think unlike the province and the federal government, which aren't expected to balance budget, and we do see long-term impact for that. Someone says, Dawn says, how often should bylaws come up for review and public ask for review? Bylaws don't often have expiry dates on them. Some of them do, like things like a fees and charges bylaw will often have to be reviewed every year, or a property tax bylaw will have to be done every year. But a lot of bylaws don't, and those ones are the ones that tend to stay in those binders and nobody has a look at them. I'm an advocate of having a look at every bylaw at least once a term, once every 4 years. Now, cities the size of Stratford, that may be impossible just because of the number of bylaws that happen and all the other business that has to happen. But if there's a regular cycle or review that takes a little longer than 4 years, potentially, so be it. You're starting to live that examined life anyway, and I think there's some validity to that. You could say the same thing about policies as well, and there are usually even more policies than there are bylaws. Sometimes a city will set up a bylaw or policy review committee or advisory committee to take that off the hands of city council itself. However, only city council can make the final decisions, but they could take advice from one of their advisory committees. The piece to this is, can public ask for a review of certain bylaws? Yes, you can. Well, the city council is under no obligation to do it, but you certainly can make that request. And if it is done respectfully, legitimately, and with a good rationale, a lot of times that will probably show up. The very first quote on my presentation this evening was that Margaret Mead quote about a small group of involved people. And if they're the ones who are paying attention, they're likely the ones who are going to get heard. That's all the notes I have right now in the chat. Did anybody else want to say anything here about where we are at in terms of legislative paramountcy or orders of government responsibilities, that kind of thing? All right, we'll keep going. Bylaws specifically, so we've dealt with the framework of bylaw. And if we look at bylaws, just a neat thing about bylaws, neat to me because I just love the governance stuff. You use the term bylaw with a hyphen on it. A lot of places don't. It's just a single word. It means nothing, no difference, of course, but it's just a little semantic thing. City, I referenced how the city has bylaws on the website, and they do. So most, if not all, bylaws are on the website. I just took a screen grab here, and this one is about some bylaws associated with neighborhood bylaw. And rather than just a list of bylaws from A to Z, I kind of like what Stratford has done here about how you've grouped the bylaws into places that make sense. So maybe some just around governance, but how council operates. These ones are around neighborhoods and neighborhood well-being. Others probably on recreation or public works, I suspect as well. And I kind of think it's a really interesting way of doing it because it increases accessibility for the citizens. So you would be free to have a look at any one of these bylaws. They will all say on them when they were created. And typically they will also say on them when they were revised or when a previous one was repealed. So you can have a look at the chronology of them a little bit. When it comes to policies, which we're going to deal with in a minute or two, they are a little different in that some of them, a lot of templates will actually have expiry dates or expiry dates don't work, but review by dates on policies, so that they say there's a bit of an automatic trigger that says 5 years from now or 10 years from now, we should review this policy. So those things are there. So any citizen, anybody who's got access to the internet, I suppose, could review the bylaws for the city. And sometimes one of the interesting things to do is compare Stratford bylaws with bylaws in other similar sized cities across the country and just see if there are some neat ideas. I'm a big fan of a term called wise practice. A lot of people are talking about best practices, but I kind of like the idea of wise. And wise to me, it's not just because of wise communities either, Lorena, there you go. I like the idea of wise because it talks about taking a best practice from somewhere else and adapting it to local circumstance. So for example, if you have a bylaw from Winnipeg, which is 5 times your size, you might see there's some neat principles in it which we could adapt to Stratford, but it won't work if we just slap the name Stratford on it. We need to take the kernel of the idea, modify it for local use. And to me, that's a wise practice. You take what works somewhere else, adapt it for your local use. So anyway, these are available to you. If we were to look at the Municipal Act, this talks about what bylaws can do, and it talks about any provide service or thing that the municipality considers necessary or desirable. So as you can see, it's a pretty broad range. And the next slide speaks more specifically to this. So this talks about what the city can do. When there, in some oaths of office or in some bylaws or some municipal purposes, they will speak to, in terms of what's benefit for the community, about necessary or desirable, whether that is necessary or desirable for the entire city, or whether that is necessary or desirable for just part of the city. Now, if city council is elected at large, they all represent the same geographical area. However, if city council is elected by wards or divisions or whatever you want to call them, then each city councillor represents a different geographical area of the city and therefore may have some different interests in mind as well. So an item which may be of benefit to my part of the city may actually be a net cost to your part of the city, and yet we're both sitting on city council. So the Act says you need to be looking at things which are of overall benefit to the city. So on balance, over time, hopefully that all wears out. But Councillor Vasilakos at the beginning talked about the greater piece in smaller rural municipalities across the country, which are divided up into electoral divisions. Sometimes there's a quid pro quo that says if some work happened in Division 1, there needs to be now some commensurate, some other work done in Division 2 or Division 3. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And that's not the way it should work, but that's the way sometimes that it does work. And that's something for citizens to keep an eye on and for municipal managers to keep an eye on as well. If we think specifically about what it is that the city can do in terms of bylaw, this is the list that comes out of the Act as well. So Section 11 of the Act, and I again added the highlights to this because it says what the city can do in this case. The corollary being that anything's not on this list is stuff that the city can't do. So it can set its own structure for the municipality and the boards or committees that it sets up. Accountability and transparency shows up specifically to this. It doesn't say whether it should be or shouldn't be accountable and transparent, but there are things I have learned like accessibility, which overarch some of what the city can do, but you still have to abide by provincial legislation on accessibility, for example. And accountability and transparency does show up. The financial management, money in, money out, how it gets spent, how it gets allocated for the audit, that sort of thing shows up. Municipal assets. Capital assets are one of the biggest line items in municipal budgets, and in many times they are something that you don't often see. I had a mayor joke to me once that it's really hard to cut a ribbon on a sewer system, but they're really important. If you try going without a water system or a sewer system, the municipality is not going to do very well. And asset management shows into this too. So it's not like building a recreation center or a new performing arts center where you can look at it and have some sort of edifice complex, if you like. But it's really important to have it to make it a complete community. So economic, social, and environmental well-being comes in too. I've noticed a lot of the Ontario legislation uses the term well-being, and a lot of it speaks to the environment. And I suspect that physical environment, when cities look at environment, my proposal to them is to look at the land and anything that happens on or under the land. So in some ways, if you're looking at environmental well-being, things like that deep infrastructure has an impact because it's a disturbance on the environment if you're going to do something like that. You've referenced climate change in here specifically too. I have a colleague by the name of Mark Anielski who's written a couple of books on well-being, an economy of well-being and the economics of happiness, at which point he's starting to measure social well-being and how I used the phrase earlier on about why people move to Stratford and what makes them stay there. And my colleague Mark has actually developed a process to start measuring some of that. Health and safety is pretty common. Services, and I love the word when things shows up in legislation too, which the municipality is authorized to provide. And finally, protection of persons and property. So emergency services shows up here, shows up here too. So those are the things the city can do. They also, so that's kind of the general piece. More specifically then, in a subsequent section of the Act, these are some of the things, if you like, that the city is authorized, the places that the city is authorized to act. The term highway shows up, but highway just really means roads from my reading of it as well. This because it specifically excludes provincial highways. Transportation systems, so trails or dog paths or transit shows up here. How you waste management, which in my eyes would include things like composting, recycling, all those kind of things too. The use of public utilities, and we see that change throughout the country too, particularly now with broadband internet. Some municipalities are starting to look at things like broadband as a public utility rather than just something that's for private consumption. And there are some other pieces too in underserved communities where electricity or natural gas sometimes are publicly owned utilities too. Parks, rec, culture, and heritage shows up here. And I think when I think of Stratford, as some of you mentioned off the top, this is what I and probably most Canadians think about as Stratford as a city. Drainage and flood control, with accepting storm sewers, and I must admit a little bit of ignorance to the storm sewer part about why that's not included, but how you move water from where it's not supposed to be to where it is supposed to be without causing problems. So flood avoidance. Structures, buildings, so building permitting, it shows up here too. Parking, except on those highways, so parking lots and street parking. Animal control, animal licensing, ECDEV, which probably is of interest to several of you. What is it, again, that makes Stratford unique? And several of you who talked about economic diversification right off the top would come in here. And then licensing of businesses, cost of licensing and monitoring of those licensing. So the next piece is about policies, but I see a few people have put some comments in the chat, so I'll just kind of respond to that. How often could a vote of city council vacate the Ginny non-disclosure agreement since the proposal is now defunct? Now you're getting to something here that is much more specific to Stratford than I can really answer. So John, I apologize, I can't give you that because there may some of those exceptions to disclosure, if they were legitimately used in things like negotiation with a third party or land use in terms of sale or purchase of land, speculating, because you don't want to give away what you're willing to pay. Some of those things will remain confidential even after the fact. I can't comment on the specifics of that one, but that's some of what I've seen with it. Are there jurisdictions that have sunset clauses in bylaws? I haven't, sorry, that's not true. I have seen some sunset clauses in some bylaws. Some of them, like I mentioned, are annual, like a property tax bylaw or a fees and charges bylaw. But other bylaws conceivably then could say this bylaw will expire on January 1st, 2025, unless it's renewed, because those sorts of things do happen. Should an update of zoning bylaws be done before a review of the OP, official plan? It's probably useful to do that, I would suggest, at least in conjunction with the official plan. The plan itself will overarch bylaws. So plan will set what you want Stratford to look like over the next X number of years, and the bylaws will be used to get to that place. So if there are bylaws which are not useful in providing for something that is identified as a priority in the official plan, then the bylaw, whatever it happens to be, zoning or otherwise, probably ought to at least be reviewed. There are some smart people who have created some of these bylaws and engineering companies and lawyers and whatnot that will have had a look at them too. Sometimes there can be unintended consequences to changes. Somebody notes that I'm cutting out at times. I apologize for that. I saw a little while ago my notes say the internet was unstable. It could just be that hotel I'm in. If it does cut out again, thank you for letting me know, Mark. But just yell at me at the time and I don't know what I'll do, but I'll wave back. One bylaw that grinds my gears is the animal bylaw, says Ken. 2014, it's still in effect, even though council received the Citizens Advisory Committee recommendations 3 years ago. City's been too busy to pass the new one. So that's one of the interesting things about city council committees, for the most part, is they are purely advisory. That city council can listen to their advice, they can take their advice, they can discount their advice, or they can do something in between. Not doing anything is acting. Again, I don't know the specifics of this, but if it is something that grinds your gears, I would suspect, and if it's something that's grinding other people's gears too, that's one of those things that small groups of citizens can really assist with. More sound. Stratford owns its own hydro. Oh, there we go. So Festival Hydro is a power producer. So that's one of those places that you actually do that. How much control does the city have over police budgets? It depends on the other. I know my answers say it depends. I apologize for that. It depends on the Police Act within Ontario. Oftentimes, municipalities, if they have their own police service, that police service is still under the authority of a higher order government act. So if there is a policing act in Ontario, and I didn't even prep for this by looking at that sort of thing, oftentimes the Police Act would set up a police commission. And a commission is separate from city council. And if a city councillor sits on a police commission, They are usually wearing their commission hat, not their city council hat. They're supposed to act in the best interest of the commission and the police service, I guess indirectly, rather than the city. Same sort of thing often happens with libraries as well. If there are specific library, that a library board member will be a board member, not a city councillor, while they're actually sitting around the board table. It's a matter of semantics in a lot of cases. However, your comment about police, so police oversight belongs to the commission. Police budget, however, is something that is a city council responsibility. And that is a budget line like fire services or like recreation or like social services in the budget. And it's up to council then to weigh the requirements of that public safety initiative, if you like, to provide the dollars to, if you have suggested, to a police, to the police department or police service at a level that they think is appropriate for what they get, given that they also have other things they've got to fund as well. We've seen some councils look, we heard that, what was it, last year, they defund the police and those sorts of things that came up. But some municipalities were saying we need to put more money into prevention. And so we're actually increasing, not necessarily police, but increasing public safety budgets because they were leaving police similar to where they were, but adding more preventative, with the idea being that short-term pain for long-term gain. Some years from now, if we can get ahead of the root causes of crime, we're not going to need as much in terms of downstream policing. That's a debate for you as citizens of Stratford and for City Council to have as well. I don't know, does that way? Okay, so I'll leave that. Police and the fire are big pieces of the budget. Absolutely, they are. Oftentimes, labor in general is the largest one in municipal government. Then infrastructure, roads, sewers, that kind of thing is pretty high as well. But in terms of services, emergency services is often quite high. And even if municipality has a contract with the RCMP. Donna asks, how many years does Stratford prepare their budget in advance? Is it 1 to 10 years in advance? I can't answer that specifically. Municipal governments typically have 1-year budgets, but they'll often put an outlook on that, a 2-year, 3-year outlook on operating budgets. We'll deal with budget a little later too. On capital budgets, however, it's usually a lot longer because the ice plant at the arena is going to last a lot longer than a lawnmower is going to last. So in terms of asset management, we look further afield. So a capital plan, if it looks at things like roads and sewers and heavy maintenance on arenas, can be up to 25 years. And it identifies needs, when the money is expected to be needed, and potentially what sources of revenue there are. Now, you're limited, of course. It can come from property taxes. It can come from some sort of a levy. It could come from a matching grant. But of course, if you're relying on money from other orders of government, it's kind of tough to be able to do that in any kind of a consistent way. But prudent asset management looks a long way out. Ken says council's working on 5-year budgets, but still only one they vote on. That's correct. I've seen Lethbridge, Alberta did a 4-year budget over the course of a term at one point, 1 or 2 terms ago. So at the beginning, they had predictable property tax increases over the course of 4 years. The problem was that they weren't able to anticipate some of the things that had happened. It wasn't COVID, but no strategy survives first contact with reality. So there's always something that gets in the way and has an impact. So a 1-year budget is mandatory for the most part, sometimes 2 or 3, with the second and third being a rolling budget. So it would say, once we're done with this year, we'll just add another year on the end of it all and just roll in 1 year into the next. So you have a pretty good idea of what the budget is going to be, even if you don't have the level of specificity of actually setting property tax rates into future years, but you have a ballpark to go for. So shorter term, almost always, you'll have shorter term budgeting for operating and longer term budgeting for capital, just because of the nature of the stuff a municipality actually does. I'm going to move on to policy if I can, unless there was anybody who had a verbal question they wanted to ask. Seeing none, we'll move on to policies. So bylaws, as you recall, were those things that require 3 votes to enact, to change, or to repeal, and were the legislative tool that municipalities use that have the highest impact and most important. You also have policies on afterwards, and that's that piece about so the municipality is predictable and it can avoid repeated questions. And I used this reference the other day and said, if you look at statute, Municipalities Act, for example, That kind of sets the skeleton of municipal structures in Ontario. If you look at bylaws, that starts to add some flesh to the bones. If you look at policies, now you're adding skin to that flesh. And then if we look a little bit later into things like culture or principles, it adds clothing to all of that. So by the time you're done all 4 of those things, Stratford is unique. There's no other place in the world quite like it. So this now we're into step 3, if you like. So putting the skin on the bones and the muscle. So here, in terms of this is our series of policies, and much like the bylaws that we referenced earlier, a lot of the policies that have an impact on you as people who live and operate and run organizations in Stratford are listed on the city's website, and they do a pretty darn good job of it, actually. And so they are there for you to have a look at, to review. Council, like bylaws, can look at these things and change them if they see fit. They would respond to the needs as they arise, and hopefully then review policies in the same sort of fashion that they would review bylaws as well. This one I happened to pick was around accountability and transparency, because I figured some of you might be quite interested in how this actually works. The policies at the bottom of this screenshot here are from the Municipal Act itself, and it talks about what sort of things that a municipality ought to have policy about. And this is the sort of reference to the Act itself. So they can have policies around sale of land or disposition of land. They can talk about hiring employees, employee numbers, employee status, that kind of thing. Relationship between council and its officers. In reality, the only person who is responsible to council is the city manager. Everybody else in the municipal structure is a staff person of the city manager, not of council. So council can't direct staff other than the city manager, and an individual member of city council can't direct the city manager either. It needs to be through an act of council itself, through a resolution or a bylaw or a policy. Procurement of goods and services shows up here. We sometimes write policies or bylaws for municipalities, and oftentimes procurement actually shows up in bylaw because it's finance rather than policy, but here we are in the Municipal Act and it's showing up in policy. One of the pieces we have seen in procurement, which is kind of neat, is a buy local provision. And it has said, and we see this a lot in the north actually, where goods and services are really expensive and quite scarce. They have said if there's a local provider, we will actually pay X% more for local than we would to bring somebody in from external, to kind of keep the dollars floating around the municipality. And they've said, we recognize that it's going to be tough. It's a tough go of it sometimes. And you as a local provider may have increased fees that others don't. So if it's going to cost us 10% more to buy truck tires from you than from somebody else, we'll still consider that equivalent. And that's just kind of a neat way of doing it for local economic development. Notice to the public comes in here too. So if there are things that are happening, construction things, or even notice of meetings, statutory bylaw changes, all those kind of things can be in here too. As are accountability and transparency, which is it's a lot stronger, I think, in Ontario than I've seen elsewhere across the country. Delegation of power and duties. Council often doesn't or can't delegate a whole lot of power and duties to anybody who's not council. But it can set up things like advisory committees, like some of the ones you referenced. One of the places we often see this is in council remuneration. No councillor likes to vote on their own salary. No councillor likes to give themselves a raise, maybe I should say that. So oftentimes a municipality will set up a committee to say, we need to get advice on what council remuneration ought to be for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years, and ask people around a citizens group or ask the chamber to be involved and provide a recommendation back to council. However, when that happens, the final decision still rests with council. But their salary is part of the budget, so they have to approve salaries as part of the budget. But they can at least say then we engaged broadly and did something about it. When this happens, things show up like if you're in a unionized community, council will get the same raise that the union gets, or they will say the council will only get cost of living allowances or something to that effect. Somebody mentioned earlier too about full-time versus part-time councillors. That's where this would potentially show up too. Protect and enhance the tree canopy, and natural vegetation. If you remember some of the note around the purposes of municipalities in the Municipal Act spoke specifically to this. And it's kind of neat to see it here in your Municipal Act as well. As with pregnancy leave and parental leave, which those of us in Alberta Well, I'm not sure if you're very thrilled with us at the moment. I'm not particularly thrilled with us at the moment. We're a long way behind on a whole lot of this stuff. But we are now starting to see things like, I don't think they've called it pregnancy, maybe parental leave for sure has been a big thing for local government councils in this part of the world as well. So those are some of the things that policies can deal with that are kind of a little bit more granular, if you like, than what bylaw deals with. It's again, the meat on the bones. So question here. I'm finished with this section. I'm just going to look at the chat here. Ken says, unless you're a large city like Toronto who record all votes on all motions, cities like Stratford just have an informal yes, no, it's recorded whatever, no accountability. Usually the way this is written is municipal acts, most of the time the municipal acts were done in days before a lot of digitization. So it's not something people thought of. In fact, I see a lot of these acts actually speak to notices have to being in newspapers. It doesn't speak to electronic distribution of notices, putting things on Facebook or websites, even though it's typically done. Newspaper still shows up in there. So oftentimes the acts will say that something is only has to be passed by a majority of the indicated majority of councillors, however that happens to be. Historically, of course, that was just everybody's in the room. You just put your hand up and that's how it works. And so it's just yes versus no, and whoever wins the day wins the vote. However, the act itself usually says if somebody wants to call for a recorded vote, they can, in which case the names of the people who voted yes and the names of the people who voted no are actually recorded in the meeting minutes, rather than just saying it carried or failed. It says so-and-so voted in favor, so-and-so voted against. In some places, a meeting procedure bylaw will go a step further and will say, we're just going to record all the votes. And if that certainly can be done. In the age of technology now, where meetings are webcast and recorded, even if it isn't a recorded vote, usually you can see who put up their hand. And so even if it's not recorded, you can have a look. It's very rare that it would be completely anonymous how people voted. There's an interesting piece in here too about abstentions, and that varies across the country. In some places, every councillor must vote unless there's a reason not to. They can't vote, like they have a conflict of interest or something called pecuniary interest. And if they don't vote when they should, they are disqualified from office and their seat is considered vacant. They're hired to do a job, and if they refuse to do their job, then go find somebody else who can do it. In other places, you can do an abstention and it's just, your vote just even counted. In some other places, if you abstain, it's counted as a no vote. And so that all has an impact on how things will actually shake out at the end of the meeting. So as for Ken's comment around accountability, unless the vote is a recorded vote, or you have a literal recording of the vote, you're right that you don't see who voted for what. Donna asks, is Stratford the CAO, the city manager? Yes. The CAO is Chief Administrative Officer. It could go by a variety of titles. If it's called city manager in Stratford, then yes, it's your city manager. What else do we have in here? Sorry, I managed to get to the top of the chat and I want to be at the bottom of the chat. Oh, somebody else already answered the CAO question. Procurement. Stratford Council has continuously and greatly increased the monetary limits staff can approve without having to go to council. Yeah, so in a procurement bylaw or procurement policy, whatever tool they use, you don't want every dollar and cent having to come to council for approval. So oftentimes there are limits on what can happen, what can be spent. And I don't know the limits within Stratford, but it would say, like, if you're a frontline person, you can spend $25 without approval. If you're a frontline manager, you can spend $1,000 without approval. If you're a senior manager, you can spend $10,000 without approval. And if you're CAO, maybe it's higher than that. And I say without approval, but it's not usually exactly that way. It's not without having to go to council for something that's not in the budget. So there are procurement limits on, if you want to spend over X amount of dollars, there are different things that you have to do. You have to get 3 bids. You have to go to an open RFP. You can sole source. Typically, sole source is the lowest amount. Just give the contract or a purchase to somebody to go out and buy paper and staples. You don't want to get 3 bids for that. If you're asking someone like me to come in and do a strategic plan for the city, it's quite common that we find out we are one of 3 companies that get asked, because it's a fairly limited market. And if it's going to cost X amount of money, it's useful to have a bit of a competitive bid. If you're going to buy that metaphorical grader, chances are that goes to like a public tender, in which case it's probably in the public works budget in terms of not an exact amount, but a range, and somebody will bid on that on the open market and come in on that. So it's, what is it? So those are the two pieces. There's sometimes a bit of an exception to that in terms of emergency. So if there's a flood, for example, and somebody has to go buy sandbags, you don't want to have to wait for the next council meeting for that to happen. So oftentimes the CAO will have something in a procurement policy that's somewhere that says under 100,000, I'm making the number up completely, but under $100,000 in an emergency situation, the CAO just goes to do it, but you have to report it to council at the next meeting. And oftentimes, so that does happen sometimes. And sometimes there will be a conversation that involves the mayor as the head of council in that too. And the mayor then will pass on information to other members of council as in due course, if you like, as part of that. So there's regular purchasing and then emergency purchasing. And by its nature, emergency publishing, I don't know where that's coming from. Emergency purchasing is done outside the budget. Because we don't budget for fires and floods and that sort of thing. We just happen. And a lot of that stuff ends up recouped by insurance anyway. So anyhow, 99.5% of city council votes are not recorded. I will have to take your word for that. Some parts of the city reporting internet problems here. Plus, a lot of people are off to see the local air show. I came in second to the snowbirds. I'm a private pilot. I'm okay coming in second to the snowbirds. And I think we're up to date. Does anybody else have?
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's Dave Hartney. Does it matter? So the voting, whether it's like 1 by 1 vote or many votes, if it's $1,000 purchase and like an expenditure, or if it's a $40 million expenditure, is it still one vote to like, for instance, if it's a 6-5 vote to spend the money, it doesn't matter the amount, eh?
No, it doesn't matter the amount.
Okay.
No, and
Is that normal?
It's normal. Yep.
Okay.
It's not. We're not. We say it is a democracy, but it's a rule of it's a majority rule. Not only that, you may have heard the term too. Once a vote is done, it's considered a council decision, and all members of council are expected to support it. Now, a lot will gripe about it behind the scenes, but in public, they're supposed to say it's the will of council, and here we go, whether it's $40 or $40 million. Now, chances are there's a whole lot more rigor that has gone into the investigation about the $40 million. Not only that, people will say they need more information. And one of the problems that councillors have is they almost never have all the information. In order to make timely decisions, sometimes they have to make those decisions based on the best information they have at the time. And that usually works out, but sometimes it can come and bite them as it turned out to be a mistake at the end of it all too. Nobody tends to fret too much over those smaller ones, nearly as much as they do about the larger ones. And sometimes it's an investment, if you like, or a budget that wasn't made. It can cause just as much of the problem of the money that was spent. I don't know if that answers your question well enough.
Yeah, no, for sure it does. I have one more. If you had that chart there that talked about why people might get into being a counselor, right? Like one was ego and blah, blah, blah. I can't remember what they are, but if
yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just lost my train of thought.
If it shows up again,
so what's the ideal? Like in my world, and maybe I'm naive, I think that the counselors should represent the opinion of their constituents, not their own opinion, or not their children's opinion, or their neighbor's opinion. It should be the opinion of Stratford.
You will get.
What's ideal?
I don't know if the ideal is whatever works for you. You have as much right to the vote that you choose to cast as anybody else does on this call or anywhere else around the country. And you will base that on whatever you consider to be the important criteria. And if you're electing at large, and so you get to elect a whole slate or suite of candidates, you might choose different things. You probably want I shouldn't say this specifically about you, but typically people want their city council to represent the depth and breadth of their community. So you don't want 11 or 13 of the same person. You want to have some difference there. Councils to me anyway, one of the major things that councils have to do is think long-term. So if they are looking at the will of the majority in the short term, sometimes that can prove problematic over the long term. If they're not investing now for a successful and sustainable future, it may be fine for the next 4 years or 8 years, but a generation from now, maybe you painted yourself into a corner. So councillors ought to be able and willing to take some of those risks, recognizing that they're investing some of their own political capital when they do that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to keep going here. Unless there's anything else. I don't want to cut off your questions either. All right. I love this stuff, you guys. Budget. Oh, here we go. So let's just a little bit on budget because we're going to have a full session on it. A note that though the province and feds fiscal year runs April 1st to March 31st, the calendar year is the budget year for municipalities. So when it comes to things like grants, it can be a little bit peculiar because if it's the province or the feds that are providing the grant, oftentimes the reporting has to be done on their schedule, not on the city's schedule. Somebody made a reference earlier too about budgeting needing to be balanced. Financial statements have to be audited so that you know there's nothing funny going on. And the auditor can't be a staff person of the city. So the bookkeeper, if you like, there probably is an auditor on staff with the city or a series of people in the finance department who probably do really good work and provide all the documentation to the auditor, but the auditor themselves is not an employee of the city. Not only that, the auditor is responsible and hired directly by council, not by the city itself. So the auditor is not responsible to the city manager or the finance director. They're responsible to council. Now, for practicality purposes, the auditor will work with city administration significantly closely during the audit period. What this means, however, is when the audit happens, the report comes to council, not specifically to administration and then administration reporting to council. So council gets to see the financial audit, whether that's the numbers or whether it's a process audit and any notes that might be part of that audit. It also means that if they want to, council can meet with the auditor in camera behind closed doors if there are questions that they have about the audit and recommendations that the auditor may have said. Now, the audit, usually provincial legislation will say that the auditor, you have to go to market with an audit for the auditing services every X number of years, 3, 4, 5 years, so that you don't have the same auditor for 40 years in a row. Now, conceivably, I guess you could, but at least you're making that choice to do that. You are, as a municipality, set and monitor budget. For administration, that means looking at things like accounts payable, accounts receivable, all the detail stuff, check registers, bank recs, all that kind of stuff. For council, however, council sets the budget at the beginning of the year that says this is the amount of money we want to spend, and this is in large buckets where we want to spend it. So what council should be looking at is variance from budget, not the budget itself. So we expect it to spend $1 million in this particular line, but we've only spent $800,000. Why is that? Or we spent 1.2 million. Why is that? So just looking at variance, if things are tracking the way they were budgeted, it means that the budget is doing what it was supposed to do. When the expenses or revenue, for that matter, start to deviate from budget, it's useful at that point for city council to get involved. So you don't want city council looking at the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month numbers. You want them looking at the strategic or the governance perspective or what happens with budget. It's way easier, however, particularly for a new councillor, if they're learning their role, to look at a budget line item and say, hey, we're spending way too much on vehicles. Our public works trucks are costing too much, and providing suggestions to that. But that's really not the role. The role is for fleet services, are we spending above or below where we thought we ought to? Now, there's oftentimes a really good explanation for that. Gas prices were really high this year, for example, so we're over on our fuel amount. Or we had fewer vehicles on the road, so our insurance costs are lower. So there are often really good reasons for it, but it's that variance from budget that's really important. When I look at budgeting as a municipality, there are, I've kind of dealt with a bit of this already, and we're going to deal with this in more detail a little bit later on too. There are two main budgets, the operating budget and the capital budget. The operating budget provides for things that are consumable on a day-to-day basis. So salaries come in here, those aforementioned paper clips come in here, keeping the lights on comes in here, and keeping the insurance paid does too. sort of the stuff that you spend on a regular basis as you go. Capital budgets are typically larger items, larger in terms of dollar amounts. So capital could be the grader. It's going to be the filter in the pool. It's going to be pickup truck, or sorry, garbage trucks, those sort of things, which are expensive and need to be replaced from time to time. So you may know, I'm talking about pickup trucks a little while ago. You may know that that pickup truck has to be replaced every 5 years. So in your capital budget, you've got every 5 years replace pickup truck. So do we put a little bit of money aside every year so that by the time 5 years rolls around, we have enough money to buy that truck? Maybe you do. If you think about longer term things like sewer pipes, maybe they have to be replaced once every 50 years and they're really expensive when you do that. So do we need to be putting a little bit of money aside every year so we can afford to replace the sewer pipes? That's where we start getting to the next piece here too. So those things are capital expenses, but you may be putting a little bit of money aside every year. And that's where reserves come in. There are some mandatory reserves that you have to have, and they are often things like a vacation allowance, vacation reserve, where staff are entitled to vacation and that vacation comes with a salary cost. So be putting a little bit of money aside every month. And then when the person takes vacation, essentially you're paying them out of that reserve budget. Other things like that grader or the pickup truck, or a really good example for large municipalities is fire apparatus. You need to buy a new ladder truck and it's going to cost you $1 million. Well, you probably don't have $1 million lying around, but once every 20 years, you could be putting $50,000 aside, and by the time you need it, the money's there. And so it's that dedicated savings, but there's also that optimum balance. So you don't just keep putting money into that. If you have a child and you've got an education savings plan, and it's going to cost $50,000 to send that kid to university, there's not much point putting $60,000 or $70,000 or $80,000 in there. So you'll just leave it, you'll max them out at that optimal balance and then just not touch it. And so that's the use of reserves. So you've got those three pieces that you can use. And there's a lot more to this, as I mentioned, in the next session. All right, next piece here is citizen involvement. We have some notes in the chat here. Where are we here? How does a council deal with conflict of interest? So what I may have to do is actually put a little bit more effort into conflict of interest into the next session, which is about roles and responsibility, role clarity. I wasn't going to do that, but I've noticed a few questions show up around conflict of interest. Oftentimes, conflict of interest is something called pecuniary interest, which is conflict of interest associated with money. So are there requirements for provincial or municipal legislation? Typically, yes, Ontario does have well, here we go. Ken has actually responded to this one about Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, but we will deal with that one a little bit later if that's okay. Councillors, I'm gonna have to look at this a bit more, but typically councillors are not allowed to vote on anything that would have a financial impact on them, their families, or their employers. Family is usually defined as the person, obviously, their spouse, children, and parents. Sometimes it goes a little bit beyond that, but in some provinces. And the benefit could be positive, or conceivably, it could be a negative benefit too. And there's a bit of an interesting quirk to this because everybody pays property taxes and council votes on property taxes. So are they not in conflict of interest when they vote to raise property taxes or decrease property taxes? And there's a little nugget in there that says the conflict of interest provisions only apply when there's a benefit to the smaller group. If it's a benefit or cost to the community at large, then there's no conflict of interest. And we'll deal with that just a little bit later. You mentioned your integrity commissioner, you're a lawyer. So Ontario I think it requires a lawyer to be an integrity commissioner. I'm not a lawyer. I have been an integrity commissioner. I was the integrity commissioner for the city of St. Albert, north of Edmonton, which is about 60 or 70,000 people. Donna says, I feel people who are running should take training before they put their names on the ballot. Yeah, absolutely. Not only that, I think there should be a test before you're given your ballot. Asset management program. Yeah, is there anyone who can run for council? So the beauty of councillors is the only difference between I'm going to get this right away. The only difference between you and me and a councillor is that they got more votes than we did. They live in the community just like the rest of us do. They pay their deposit just like any of the rest of us could. They're a citizen of Canada, presumably, well, they have to be. And they just chose to put their name on the ballot. We didn't. Anything else before I move on to citizen involvement, recognizing we're coming up to 8 o'clock? So this isn't really about what the city can and can't do, but I think it's important to talk to some of these things too, because it's about how we interact with the city. Oh, here we go. So the only fundamental difference between a council member and any other member is that they got more votes than we did. That's just it. They put their name on their ballots. So there is often no formal requirement for councilor orientation to actually attend an orientation unless the city decides that there is. So this is the sort of thing that would show up in a code of conduct or code of ethics bylaw, that thou shalt show up. The municipal legislation is often written such that, and it may be in Ontario, it may not, I might be wrong, says that the municipality has to offer an orientation, but it doesn't actually say anybody has to show up. But that's where the code of conduct comes in that says thou shalt show up. There is no requirement for candidate training. We do a bunch of it. We talk about it. The desire for that is either to confirm in those people who are running for the right reasons that they are running for the right reason, to maybe dissuade those people who are running for the wrong reasons, and to illuminate to people what the job actually is. So when we do candidate training, we usually ask an outgoing member of council who's declared that they're not running again to participate and actually speak to what the reality of the situation is. Something I would note here about just the vagaries of the year, because January to December is the council year or the fiscal year, that means the new budget starts January 1st. If you have fall elections, you bring in brand new people who conceivably have never worked in local government, who may have never been elected to anything in their lives, who all of a sudden have to vote on a multi-million-dollar budget without any real knowledge of how to do it. And to me, that's one of the drawbacks of the way our local government system is set up in Canada. So this isn't anything that is specific to Ontario. It is something that does show up, however. So government doesn't stop just because of the election cycle. So there's a difference too between the head of that beast, the council, and everybody else who working from the city manager on down. They just have to keep on going. Another principle here, and one of mine anyway, is if I look at a council, and this is accountability and transparency. Does council keep everything public unless there's a reason not to? Or does council keep everything private unless they actually have to release it? Now you'd have to challenge individual members of council with that, but it does become cultural as well. Because of the work that council members do in closed session or in camera, they by default know more about what's going on in Stratford than anybody else, including their spouses, hopefully, because they are privy to the information that's happening, that solicitor-client privilege, that negotiation on land sales, all the evaluation of the city manager, all those things happen privately. And so the members of council know more about it. But my principle would be, and I see this too differently on candidates than on councillors. Candidates are all big on transparency because they don't think we see enough of what's going on in the city. However, once people get on the other side of that table and realize why things are the way they are, they may not go all the way to say, you know what, we need to keep a whole lot more things quiet than I thought we did, or private than I thought we did. But they do start to understand why things are the way they are. And one of the frustrations might be that because things are confidential, you can't actually be told why they're confidential, just that they're confidential. Another note here is about something, when we do investigations into municipalities that aren't working well, we have this saying about it's never about what it's about. We're often addressing the symptoms of something rather than the cause of something. And so if we often do interviews as parts of these things, but we often hear essentially the same circumstance described in different ways. And things become self-evident facts. Anytime there's a Facebook group involved, I'm suspicious, for example. Or anytime there's that group of, well, typically the old fellas who gather down at the A&W for coffee on Tuesday mornings, talking about common sense, they become self-evidently obvious because they're talking to themselves. So my encouragement in all these sorts of things is get to know how the other half lives or what the other side thinks. That we'll talk a lot more about that in the session on engagement. And finally, where you stand depends on where you sit. And this is the piece about what you see as a candidate or perhaps as a citizen, those of you who are here, versus those who are council members. And I don't think we have any council members left here today, but those who are members of city council may see the same issue from a slightly different perspective because they're sitting on a different side of the table. Not better, not worse, just different, and therefore able to perhaps provide some rationale to why things are the way they are. And some of it becomes cultural too. So if there's a municipality that doesn't really fall on the side of transparency or accountability, at some point, it's always been that way. And that's where culture takes hold, and it's really hard to change culture once it's ingrained. First of all, you have to realize it's there. And the only way you realize it's there is by looking somewhere else to find out what the culture is there. So those are some of the principles. I kind of already dealt with a bunch of these as well, but if we talk about some of the concepts here about the tools that are available to you is accountability and transparency. Now that is something that is required of you, not you specifically, but of Stratford. And you can't, again, I probably beat this one to death already about transparency and accountability. The use of in-camera sessions, they're a legitimate tool in local government. In fact, all governments, if you think about it, local government is the only order of government in Canada which does most of their business in public. You think about caucus and cabinet solidarity at the provincial or federal orders of government, and almost nothing happens in public. If you watch what's going on in the legislature or in House of Commons, a lot of that just seems to be for show. It's question periods, sound bites, that sort of thing. However, local government has to do so much more in public than the other orders do. Sometimes that raises the ire of people too, because the same discussions that would happen behind closed doors and nobody's watching are now happening in public, and people have to be accountable for some of the things that they say. When it does come to closed session, we use the term land, labor, and legal, and that's really simplistic. But there are very limited topics that can actually be discussed in a closed session, and they do kind of generally deal with things like what we do with land, purchasing or zoning or selling land, or labor, union negotiations, or the city manager's annual performance review, or legal if the city's being sued or wants to sue somebody else, or advice from the lawyer. Those are the sorts of things that often happen in camera. However, only the discussion can happen in camera. If there's a decision that has to be made, that has to be made in public. Typically, the only motion or resolution that can be provided in camera is to come out of in camera. And so that's the only one that's actually recorded in the minutes of the meeting. And some municipalities go further on this than others, but the reason for going in camera has to be provided. And that has to include a reference to exceptions or exemptions from disclosure in the Freedom of Information Act. Some go further than that and actually say what the topic was in general without giving away too much. And some of them will provide names of who actually was there. The assumption being that members of city council were there, but they're the only ones who you should assume that of. City manager is often there. Some members of city manager may be there to provide advice. And there may be some external people. For example, I go into in camera if we're dealing with an organizational review, for example. And sometimes my name shows up on the minutes and sometimes it doesn't. We're going to deal with engagement specifically in session 3, but recognizing that engagement is a two-way process. It talks about how you deal with the city and how the city deals with you. Whereas communication is more of a one-way. It's the city telling you what's going on. There's something called a continuum of engagement that's produced by the International Association of Public Participation, or IAP2. And it goes all the way from one end about informing people. So if you think about what's on the city's website, or a newsletter that you may get, or something that shows up on a sign and it's just pushing information to you, that's one way. The other end of this full spectrum is actually empowering somebody else to make a decision. So that's real engagement. But because local government is government and the final decision is council's, we don't go quite that far. Council can take advice from people or groups, and that's about as far down that continuum we get. I made a reference earlier to council and how they deal with their own remuneration. And that's where I see as close to full-on engagement as you get. The final decision, of course, still resting with council. So those are the topics we're going to talk about next time. If we think about engagement, I started off this whole session about if nobody lived where you do, there would be no need for Stratford, there would be no need for local government, no need for staff, no need for budgets and property taxes. So if you think about ways that you can engage with your city, these are some of the obvious ones, and perhaps some of the less obvious ones. Of course, there's a huge referendum that happens every 4 years, and a little bit more if there's a by-election. Somebody made a reference earlier about whether these are popularity contests. The larger the municipality, the less it's a popularity contest. In small villages, it often is a popularity contest, or it's completely the opposite. I hate that guy, so I'm not voting for him, because I went to school with him and we had a fight out by the bike racks in 1964. So something to that effect. You can get involved in council committees. Council meetings and committees are by default open. So we call them public meetings because the public can watch government being done, not because the public can participate, but it's just being able to watch it. Some of the council committees will have citizen reps on them. Oftentimes the advisory committees, an economic development advisory committee or a recreation advisory committee will have people on it. You can actually go and speak to council as a registered delegation, which often you would have to provide a presentation, the topic you want to talk about. You'd be given X number of minutes to provide your presentation and maybe some time for questions afterwards. There's also public hearings, statutory. Sometimes public hearings are required by statute. So in order for a bylaw to happen between first and second reading or between second and third reading, I can't remember which, you actually have to have an open hearing, in which case anybody who wants to have a say can. Some of these are non-statutory public hearings, which means that the city's just decided that it would be a good idea to hear from people. And so the council has said yes for this, even though we don't have to, we're going to open this issue to a public hearing. Sometimes there are open houses at which the same 4 people generally appear. Some fewer and fewer places are using those. They can be virtual or they can be real. They can have flip charts and notice boards about a particular topic, neighborhood revitalization or something like that, where you want to meet and talk about something local. And then of course, these are your counselors. You can contact them directly. Be nice to them. They'll get more flies with sugar than we do honey than you do with, screwed that one up completely, than you do with vinegar anyway. So those are just ways that you can engage. Just before we get on with what's going on, because we're coming to the end now, there's a few more questions here I'll get to. Or comments. Some of these are actually comments. Conflict of Interest Act declares pecuniary interest and how you deal with it. So we will actually deal with that. One of the interesting things about even pecuniary interest, where financial conflict of interest, if, for example, I as a citizen who is also a city councillor own a piece of land and I want to say subdivide it, put two infill houses onto one. As a member of city council, I can't vote on that decision. But as the landowner, I still retain my rights as the landowner and as a citizen. So I could actually get up from my council seat, walk around, sit down in the council chamber and present to council on that topic and be present through that debate because I don't lose my rights as a citizen and a landowner. So just a bit of a nuance to that. Where are we? Commonwealth Women's Parliamentarians of Canada have good training materials called She Should Run, They Do. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities has good material on their website too. And sometimes provincial municipal associations do as well. They're looking for a lot more inclusivity and diversity on municipal councils. So there's a lot of work and effort and money being put into promoting the role to those particular groups. Also note here from Vicky about Grey and Bruce counties offering training to female candidates about what it means to be a municipal councillor. electhernow.ca. Somebody note from Jay, decisions in camera are secret and not transparent have happened. What are the discipline measures if that is done? That's where you would get your integrity commissioner involved, most likely. It's really difficult to prove, however, that happens. Because the informal decision, if you like a straw vote, sometimes does happen. But the formal decision has to be done publicly. One of the things we have found whenever we do investigations, the first place we start to look is what's got out of in camera that shouldn't have got out of in camera. Whether that's something verbal or something written, because you're not supposed to take notes, you're not supposed to record meetings. Somebody invariably puts their iPhone on the table and turns it on, especially if we're in a virtual environment and nobody can really tell what else is going on. So that's one of the first places we look in a dysfunctional municipality, but what's come out of in camera that it shouldn't. So it's, to me, that's one of the primary good governance concepts is what needs to be in, what happens in camera needs to stay in camera. Someone said, I think Councillor Henderson and CEO Thompson are still online. If so, I'm not looking at very many people, but that's fantastic if they are. And a note about who is to organize training of city for upcoming councillors before the name goes on the ballot. So this is one of those places, again, a member of a citizen who meets the criteria for being eligible for nomination can put their name on the ballot if they can come up with the signatures and the deposit and they don't move out of town. Anybody can do that. And from then, so some of these websites that people have suggested are places that you can get training. Sometimes municipalities will put on training for candidates We do a lot of that we do training typically before nomination day, so they can choose whether to continue with nomination or choose not to. By the time nomination day has passed and their name is on the ballot and they bought signs, they're kind of committed. So we typically do it before that happens. Their ongoing professional development for councillors is important too, because they will usually do an orientation right after the election, within a few days of the election. And it's the sort of stuff we're talking about today, but a whole lot more and in a whole lot more detail. And there's no way they can remember it all. So some municipalities will do ongoing professional development and have a budget in the budget for training for councillors. So they'll bring in a registered parliamentarian to talk about meeting procedure, or they'll bring in someone like me to talk about good governance, or they'll bring in somebody who's got a local bent to talk about local issues. Others there are sometimes municipal associations offer elected official training programs. There are provincial and national conferences as well that people can go to. So there are all kinds of ways that the real public servant who wants to serve their community better can do it. And most of them do it to some extent or another. There are some caveats to that. Sometimes city councillors want to go and do a corporate directorship and have the city pay for that. I'm a little iffy on whether that's a legitimate expense or an MBA. Some of them will want to do a program of study, and sometimes it's legitimate, but that's ultimately up to council to decide. And some of those things can be laid out in policy too. A couple of notes here. Oversight mechanisms as watchdogs. So you've got your integrity commissioner. Members of council are watchdogs on each other. When we deal with conflict of interest, it's a whole section on ethics. Actually, I'm doing an ethics session in about an hour for a Chamber of Commerce board. And so there's a lot more that can be dealt with that. But the city council retains final decision-making authority. And so that oversight has to be there, as does a relationship then between city council and city administration, particularly the city manager. Does the city manager have that real or perceived ability to push back on members of city council, to remind them of things, to talk about things that perhaps are starting to go astray? A lot of times they do. They wouldn't happen in a council meeting. Usually it would be quiet conversation. Maybe it's in camera, maybe it's like a one-on-one, those sort of things that would happen. Somebody notes here too about some sessions have been offered by city councilors collaboratively. And they're a great source of information. And I mentioned when we do candidate orientations, we often bring in a retired councillor to do that because nobody knows it like they do. Or I do certainly agree with that. Somebody says, Bill says have to go at 8. Good night, Bill. We're going to leave. Oh, it's 8 o'clock right now. I forgot. I didn't actually realize what time it was. Just going through your questions here. So if we look at that, I'm going to leave the questions for there. And next time we get together, we're going to talk about role clarity. So start big and work down. So we're going to talk about council as the collective. We're going to talk about the office of the councillor, the office of the mayor. Councillor and mayor are very closely related. They're both councillors. And then we're going to talk about the administration, typically the city manager, but potentially some others as well. I might throw a little bit in there to expand a little bit on conflict of interest, pecuniary interest, just because a bunch of you have brought it up tonight. And it wasn't something that really fits in budget or into engagement. So I'll see if we can throw a little bit of that in too. What I will say as I was planning these sessions is this is very similar to what we would do at a council orientation, but they get a whole lot more details. So we've had to be quite circumspect on what it is we actually provide. So with that in mind, the last item on note here, thanks for the answers, Ken. Thank you, Ken. You and I should have another conversation. You've got a ton of questions here. I appreciate the input to this. Before we pass on, that's the wrong way to say it. Before we leave this session, are there things that have worked for you that now in terms of just the structure of this, because I don't do this very often, are there things in terms of structure that need to change? And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on things they'd like to see done differently or exactly the same. Things you liked or didn't like. You can put it in the chat or you can just blurt it out. And as we go that, I'm just going to move to my last slide here, which is, which is just my contact information if you want it. The mural behind, actually an interesting story here, the mural behind this, which you can't really see very well, actually was on the wall of town office in Hay River, Northwest Territories, because I get everywhere. Okay, so some nice comments, great comments in the chat. Any last comments before we wrap up? All right, I gave you all your 5 seconds. You're all off the. Ken, you had your hand up. Thank you. You're the first and only person thus far who's actually put his hand up. Go ahead. You are muted though, so. Oh, is it? Just, oh, that's just a clap. You didn't actually want to say anything.
It's just applause.
Oh, thank
for
you.
doing this.
So really, that's what I was after. I was just pulling so that you actually have to say something, so I feel good about myself. So you've got my contact information here. If there is something that comes up tonight as you're ruminating over this over the next few days, and you want to ask me a question or things that ought to be on a future session, let me know. As I started at the beginning, I really applaud the city for going with this and doing something, because this isn't controlled. So you can ask whatever questions you want and talk about topics that you want to talk about, because I'll talk about them all, because I really like the sector. So keep that in mind. If you do have anything you want to talk about over the next little while, please contact me. If not, it sounds like we'll see some or all of you in the next couple of weeks from now. If you enjoyed this, and sounds like some of you did at least, and a lot of you are still here, please let other people know. The link and everything I think is on the city's website. And have people come out. I'm quite happy to talk about the state of local government in Ontario specifically, but in Canada more generally. So if there's nothing else, I will bid you all good night and stop the recording, and we'll see where it all goes.
Thanks so much, Ian.
Okay.
Great session.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night, everybody.